This is Deb Wenger. This week we're going to talk about newspapers and news. Because when we talk about newspapers, we really are talking about the history of journalism in this country, because newspapers really are sort of the incubator of modern journalism as it's practiced today. So early American newspapers, and I'm talking about the period of time from about 1690 or so to the early 1700s, were very different than today's paper. They were mostly for what would be considered the elite. They were expensive and had small circulations. They were sometimes published by political parties themselves, so they would focus on a particular point of view, focus more on opinion than news as we would define it today. We're talking about papers, as your textbook mentions, such as the New England Current or Public Occurrences, which tried to move toward a general public audience, but still were very much opinion-driven versus kind of the objective reporting that we know today. Then came the penny press, and this shook up journalism and set it really on its current path. So Benjamin Day with the New York Sun, his idea is that the news was for everyone, that he wanted to reach that mass audience. So his paper and others were sold on the street for 1 or 2 cents an issue. It was supported primarily by advertising, a situation that continues to exist today. And it was really one of the first papers to focus on news. This idea that you would report on stories objectively, offering multiple viewpoints as a way to appeal to a larger audience. So previously, if you reported on a bill before Congress in a paper that takes a political point of view, you're going to certainly favor your party's view. In the penny press and in today's traditional mainstream media, you're going to get what is a more objective method of reporting on that story, which is seeking out multiple points of view to be able to paint a bigger picture, or hopefully a more accurate picture, of that bill and the impact it may have on Americans. So this was a change to advertising-supported media, as well as a change in the way that content was reported, the way that news was reported. Then came the newspaper wars between William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer. So Pulitzer's New York World is credited often with the creation of the modern front page, with its banner headlines really screaming about the big stories of the day. His paper targeted immigrants and women, immigrants who were using the paper, learning to read. Why target women? Because they often controlled the household expenditures, and so advertisers were eager to get their products in front of women. Female journalist Nellie Bly was hired by the paper, and she pulled off what some would call stunt journalism, basically creating the story herself. She disguised herself as someone with mental health issues and infiltrated an insane asylum. That kind of reporting is frowned upon today, but still, iterations of it still do occur. And then there was his biggest competitor, William Randolph Hearst and the New York Journal. So the two papers and their competition gave rise to a term called yellow journalism. It actually started when the two papers were sort of battling over a comic called The Yellow Kid, which was very popular at the time, and both papers wanted to publish it. But yellow journalism has come to mean sensational type stories. Like, both papers actually spent a great deal of time and energy promoting the Spanish-American War in Cuba. Why promote a war? Why would anybody want a war to occur? Well, because it means big business for journalism, for newspapers at the time. If any of you have seen the modern movie Wag the Dog, for example, you know what I'm talking about. So the idea that war is good business for journalism. So the modern day newspaper does have some differences than when Pulitzer and Hearst were running their competing papers. Few cities actually have daily competition. New York, of course, is an exception. I used to work in Tampa, Florida, where there continue to be 2 daily newspapers that compete. Most newspapers are owned by large chains, not by individuals or individual families. The largest chain of all is Gannett, which publishes USA Today, and approximately 85 daily newspapers. Newspaper revenues are falling. The worst problems seem to be at what you would call the metropolitan papers, so the Chicago Tribune or the Los Angeles Times. That doesn't mean that newspapers aren't still profitable. They just aren't as profitable as they used to be. So what are some of the biggest papers, the most widely recognized papers? Well, we've already mentioned USA Today. It had a powerful influence on the newspaper industry when it was first launched. It brought color and design to the forefront. A lot of the images that we've been seeing up to this point, you may have noticed, very much black ink, white paper, few photographs, dense copy. So USA Today really created a much more visually appealing newspaper, something that would attract people's eyes and make them want to pick it up and read it. And that's influenced many other papers. Originally, it was highly criticized. This speaks to one of the truths that your textbook author talks about, that there's always fear when something new happens within a medium. And originally the paper was called McPaper, or it was criticized for creating what they called News McNuggets, sort of saying that this wasn't a full meal, it was kind of a little news snack. But by the mid-2000s, USA Today had taken steps to really strengthen its reporting, became a much bigger force in American journalism, and had a daily circulation almost at 2 million people. So made significant progress and continues to be a national newspaper here in the U.S. Also has moved fairly strongly into the digital world. There's a USA Today app, obviously a website. So it's becoming more than quote-unquote just a newspaper company, but is trying to be much more of a media powerhouse. Wall Street Journal, another what your text calls national newspaper, and its focus, of course, is on financial news. It's owned by Rupert Murdoch's News Corp now, but has not always been. And its circulation is over 2 million approximately. It is a highly regarded paper. Its editorial page is what many would consider one of, if not the leading conservative voice in U.S. journalism. And the model, the Wall Street Journal model, has been studied by a lot of people trying to figure out how to save print journalism, although I'm not really sure it needs saving, it's just evolving. But they did not allow their content to be distributed freely on the internet. They have a very, what's considered by the industry, a very high subscription price. So they provide unique content that people really can't easily get elsewhere, and they charge for it. And because it's valuable and important to the audience, they really know their audience, they've been able to remain very successful despite all the other economic upheaval affecting the newspaper business. The New York Times, another national newspaper in my view. This is a newspaper that you can find. You travel to any U.S. city and you can find a New York Times, pick it up and read it. You can find a New York Times, pick it up and read it in Farley Hall on the Ole Miss campus. There's a stack of New York Times available for students to pick up right inside the front door of Farley. I encourage you to do it. If you're not already a New York Times reader, pick up a copy, read it, and get a sense of what that paper is all about. So the New York Times started as a penny paper, but has evolved into something much, much more. By and large, it defines what is news in the U.S. I don't think that that's too broad a statement. I think your text talks about how a good review in the New York Times can make or break a play. We have an example of that in the journalism school. One of my colleagues, Professor Alicia Steele, had produced or was working on a book about African American church mothers in the Delta of Mississippi. She was trying to find a publisher, and New York Times reporter found out about the book that she was working on when he was visiting here one week, wrote a story about her book and her efforts to find a publisher, and within hours of that story being published in the New York Times, she was getting calls from editors who wanted to put her book in print. It is going to be coming out this spring in time for Mother's Day. So that's the kind of power that the New York Times has. Although some of the content is tied to New York, it does really have a national circulation. And even as strong as its journalism is, and as important as the New York Times is in setting kind of the agenda for public discourse in the U.S., it has had a somewhat difficult transition to the digital world. You may or may not have heard about the leaking of a confidential internal report about New York Times journalism and how the company was transitioning to a world where most people are consuming their content through a mass communication device such as an iPad or a smartphone, a website, and fewer reading the hard copy print edition. And one of the things that they've realized is that they have to change their thinking. And that probably is a good sort of description of what's happening in newspaper journalism in general, that we have to change our thinking about what it means to be a journalist and what it means to work in an environment where people may choose that really want access to your information, want access to the news you produce, but they don't want to have to pick it up and read it on newsprint. The Washington Post, much less of a national reach than the New York Times, but still a very important American newspaper. Came to national prominence and became something of a household name during Watergate with the reporting of Woodward and Bernstein. You may have heard that back in the 70s, a whole generation of young people decided to go to college and become journalists because Woodward and Bernstein became sort of modern day heroes, and they were influenced by what they were able to accomplish, holding the powerful accountable. It's certainly a prominent source of government news and is, inside the Beltway in our nation's capital. It's a must for anyone operating in the government sphere to be familiar with what's being reported in the Washington Post. In 2013, it was purchased by Amazon's Jeff Bezos, who really has a lot of people interested in the Washington Post again, looking to find out what in the heck is going to happen to a paper that's owned by an entrepreneur, certainly someone that understands technology, and how will that paper change under his ownership. Remember, we talked about in the media effects chapter the idea that ownership might have an impact on the media produced by an organization. So how will the news of this paper change because of its ownership? So, of course, there are many community and suburban papers, actually many more community and suburban papers than there are metro dailies or national newspapers. And these, of course, like our own Oxford Eagle here in Oxford, Mississippi, serve individual communities and suburbs. They publish news that people really can't get anywhere else. High school sports, great example. I bet many of the people listening to this lecture have actually had their name appear in the paper because they scored, 43 points in a basketball game, or, made a touchdown, or broke a school record in track. So they're valuable and important. And in fact, that's where most of the jobs in journalism are today. In the community and suburban papers, there are thousands of them. Here in the Meek School of Journalism, I would say at least once or twice a month, we get a call from some editor who says, help, I can't find anybody to come work in Brookhaven or come work in Marks, Mississippi. Um, if you love to write and journalism is your passion and you don't mind starting in small town USA, there is a career path for you in the community and suburban papers. The other types of newspapers, your text talks about the African American press, which played a big role in civil rights coverage, for example, or even as far back as espousing freedom for slaves. The Chicago Defender, which was still publishing well into the 2000s. The gay press, which, before they became professional-looking publications, were sometimes copied on office equipment and distributed in gay bars. But they've sort of disappeared for the most part. There still are some from the newspaper world because gay advertising is moving more and more into big media. So we've been talking a lot about journalism, we've been talking a lot about newspapers, but we're sort of making an assumption here that you already know what news is. So how does news differ from information? So if I tell you I drove to work this morning, that's information that I'm sharing with you, but that's not really news. So journalists have to figure out what information of all the things that they learn on any given day actually rises to the level of news. And so they use a set of criteria to help them decide whether the information they've learned is worthy of putting in the newspaper, on a newscast, on a website, etc. So one of the most important criteria is timeliness. So when did this happen? When will it happen? Is there some reason why this information should be reported right now? So in general, the more timely something is, the more newsworthy it is. Proximity. So this speaks to the idea that if we are covering our local community, that something that happens locally is more likely to be newsworthy than something that happens 2 states over. Of course, there are exceptions to this. If there's a major national or international story, you may take steps to report on that story for your own community. But by and large, what happens locally is more likely to be newsworthy for your audience than something that happens in another location. Prominence. So who are we talking about? A friend of mine who works for Bleacher Report told me that at one point there was a big furor over LeBron James and his obsession apparently with brown shoes. So the fact that LeBron James was wearing brown shoes was actually getting lots of traction and lots of interest on Bleacher Report. Now, the fact that sometimes I wear brown shoes has had absolutely no impact on the news world. And so that would be an example of somebody who is well known, does something that becomes news versus someone like me. Consequence. So what is the impact of this information on the audience? So if a hurricane is, storming its way toward the Mississippi coast, it obviously has significant consequence, or the potential for significant consequence. So that information becomes newsworthy. Rarity. Is it the first time something happened? Is it the last time something will happen? Is it the biggest? Is it the smallest? So the more unique the piece of information is, the more likely it is to be news. And then finally, there is just general human interest. So a story about a mother's struggle to get her child the health care he or she needs is a story that tugs at the heartstrings of many of us, especially those of us who are parents. If a small town team comes out of nowhere and wins the state championship, that's a human interest story. So stories that speak to us just on a human level. So our discussion this week has been about newspapers, of course, and certainly newspapers are synonymous with journalism in the minds of a lot of people. Much of the best reporting of the last century has come from newspapers. But these fundamentals, these foundational principles of how we determine what is news and what isn't, are relevant regardless of what platform you're talking about. So these same criteria are applied whether you're reporting for a mobile news app or you've got a story on the front page of the New York Times. So because newspapers are so synonymous with journalism, the future of newspapers gets a lot of discussion because many people believe that newspapers and journalism as a whole help preserve democracy, help keep our society functioning. So understanding where newspapers are headed is critical to understanding the future of society. So what's going on? Newspapers at the national level and many newspapers at lower levels are still profitable. At the national level, they still seem to be holding on to circulation, and in fact, many smaller papers are holding steady with circulation as well. Most of the job losses have been at the major urban papers like the Chicago Tribune, the Los Angeles Times. As I said, there are many jobs that go begging at some of the smaller newspapers. And there's been a shift in understanding that if you want to hold on to your audience, you have to give them unique content. So if I am an editor for the Sun Herald in Biloxi, for example, I probably am not going to report on something that's going on in Russia unless it has a direct impact on people in Biloxi. This idea of what's called hyper-local news. So I'm going to cover news that really affects people that live in my coverage area. And that seems to be a way for newspapers to differentiate themselves from the myriad of sources that are available in a digital world. Also, newspapers are working to figure out how to make money beyond advertising. Newspapers have lost a lot of advertising revenue, so they're looking to try to get paid for their online content. So pick up potentially digital advertising dollars, but also develop new revenue sources. So can they make a paid app work? Can they publish things other than newspapers and make money from that? Can they sponsor events within communities? So newspapers are really having to rethink the way they do business. A friend of mine says the least important part of the word newspaper is paper. So does it really matter if the journalism that you're producing is consumed in a printed product, or does it just matter that it's being consumed and that you're making enough money to continue to be profitable? So newspapers are in fact moving into mobile and other distribution models, figuring that the most important part of the word newspaper is news. So as always, log on to Blackboard, make sure you're keeping up with assignments and other tasks, and don't forget to tweet. Hashtag UMJOUR101. We'd love to see what you're reading about the media industry, about newspapers in particular, or anything that's relevant to our discussions. As I said, I'll be tracking who tweets what, and if you start to do it consistently and you put some good content out there, I promise you a little bonus on your final exam.